So today I'm going to show you how I made this short clip here. I'm going to go over all the steps that were involved to make this. So an RBD fracture, RBD simulation for the ice, the lightning bolt, the flip simulation, and at the end do a quick overview of the lighting setup and the materials. So let's get going. I start off by importing the can. I modeled this and I included material groups for me to use. As you can see here, the top and the bottom have their own group. And I use those groups in the material node, just set up two materials here, use the group and assign the material accordingly. Now scale this down, and it's really important to have a good scale for the flip simulation you're doing. So depending on the look you're going for, you will need to scale this up and down and then see how your simulation looks. I use a node so I can reference my can at the stage for my simulations, and then I use a subdivision node to add some more detail for final rendering. For the ice, I just import my can. I convert it with a VDB from polygons into an SDF. Here, by default, this is set to surface. We want to name this density. Instead, just use the VDB reshape, scale that up a little bit with a dilate, converted it to fog volume, SDF to fog, and then I use a VDB activate to expand the voxel area that is used for calculation. And if you don't do that, you'll get some artifacts when you're pushing out the noise in the next step, since this is the volume bounds that is used to calculate the VDB. So if you don't do this, it will be cut off at the volume bounds. For the noise, I just used a volume VUP. In here, took the position, added it to my anti-alias noise, and then added it back to position of the VDB. And then we need a volume sample file node, sample the position, make sure this is set to primitive name, and the primitive name here is set to density, and this is connected up as you can see here. Next up, we convert this whole thing back to an SDF, and we do this so I can use the VDB combine to subtract the can shape from this ice shape that I used. Grab my can, I VDB from polygons this as well. Here I just copy the parameter of the voxel size and then right click, paste relative reference, so you get the same size there. And then you do a SDF difference to subtract that. And then I convert that back to polygons. Then we got this. And if I use the clip node, you can see that we have a nice cavity for the can itself. For the next step, we want to create some UVs before we fracture this. I grabbed a UV project node, set that to cylindrical, and click initialize if it's looking wrong, and with a quick shade node, you can look how your UVs look. In this case, at the top and the bottom, they are going to be stretched because of the cylindrical projection method. If you select the UV project node and hit enter here, you can see how that's projected. So obviously they're going to be stretched here, but for this shot, this worked out fine. If you want to check your UVs in the viewport, just hit space 5. You'll see how your UVs look. And if you hit space 1 in the viewport, you'll jump back to the 3D viewport. And then I used RBD material fracture node, concrete, that's the standard. And then you play around with the scatter points. And I played around with the scatter seed to change the amount of fracturing I have. If you want to preview this, this is my cached version. You can just middle mouse, hold down Control, and middle mouse click on the node. In this case, if you click name, you can preview this attribute and then you can quickly see how your fracture looks, or you drop down an RBD explode node and just wire that up, and then you can scale it up to see how your pieces look in 3D space. And here you can change the detail settings, so you can change the noise of the interior. And then you want to drop down an RBD connected faces node. And this is really important to have attributes needed to delete the inside faces later on after the simulation is complete for final rendering. Then we want to cache this out, because the RBD material fracture is pretty slow, so I like to cache that out. Next step is to create the UVs for the inside, for the interior faces. So the easiest way to do this is just to drop down a UV auto seam, choose the inside group, and change the splitting method for grain islands to existing islands. Then you drop down a UV flatten node, make sure you have the seam selected, the group selected here. You see I have exterior UVs layered on top of the interior UVs, but for this purpose that's totally fine. If you would want to make it a bit cleaner, if you had specific plans for the material, then you could also just make a UDIM, but for this is totally fine. I just use an assembly node and make sure to enable create packed primitives and this is necessary for the RBD sim later on. What I do now is create some base velocity by just normalizing the position vectors. So v at v equals normalize at p, and then I multiply that with a channel float just to increase the strength. So here you can set the base strength. These velocities, I pass them on to this attribute VOP. In here, I just set up some basic curl noise. So I take the position, pipe that into the curl noise, and here I promoted the parameters I would want to change to dial in the look of the velocities. You can right click and go to Vex swap options and create input parameters. Then all of these will have these little icons here, and then you can control it upstream. So one level up, you'll have these options pop up, or you can middle mouse click here on a single parameter and then click promote parameter if you want to do single ones. And this is the same thing I did here for the multiply, which again is just to control the strength of the noise. So here I have a multiplier for that. So just drop down the multiply, wire that up, and then here you middle mouse click, promote parameter, and if you click on this again, you can just rename this to multiply, like a noise strength multiplier or something. Whatever you want, whatever makes sense for you. I call this curl noise strength, yeah. Then I add this to the velocities, and then I have another add node to add a velocity direction. So in this case, I drop down a parameter node, set that to 3 float. So I have 3 values for the velocities to change, wire that up. I have another final multiplier just to be able to control the strength of all the velocities at once. So we go up 1 level. You can see now that you can change the strength of the velocities here, the noise, whatnot. And this is really nice to do, so you can dial in the look you want in your RBD sim, and it's a little bit quicker to have this control up here instead of diving in like that when you're setting up the simulation. If you want to have the velocity preview like this, a cool way to do that is here, go to click the cog icon there, go to add visualizer marker, and then this will pop up, and then just choose vector trail or point trail. Choose your velocities, and in this case I had to think, because it's a vector trail, I had to, yeah, I think this made more sense for me. So the velocities are pointing down, but in my mind it makes more sense if they point in that direction where they're going to be moving. In my .NET, so if you drop down a .NET, so the base is just the rigid body solver, an RBD packed object, which gets its geo from the first context geometry, create animated static objects here, and I think everything else on the RBD packed object is default. On the rigid body solver, I think I also didn't change anything. This is all default. The cool thing about this one is that I just have to disable the simulation, reset it, disable this, so this won't simulate. Then if I dive into my subsolver that I have here connected to my multi-solver, like so, I have an animated group. So as you can see here, this moves down and creates a group with this. So I have a sphere that I reshaped, the bed node, and then I animated it with a transform node, and then pipe that into the group node here. I name the group active and set group type to points, enable keep in bounding box region, and then set the bounding objects to points or vertices only. And then with a wrangle, I can set the active points to be the ones that are in that group by just writing I at active equals 1. That's the exact thing you need. And then making sure the group is selected up here. And if you have that all set up like this, only the pieces that are in that group are going to be simulated. The one thing I have here is just a pop attract, which is set to a negative value, which then pushes out the particles or the RBD packed objects, just to make it feel like there's an impact at the top here. And then I added a pop drag spin, so the individual pieces don't spin like crazy. So this just slows down the spinning of the individual pieces. Yeah, and then I have the static object wired out to the collision object, which in this case is just the can. So I have this wired up here, Everything here is pretty standard as well. I just increase the resolution. So if I just deactivate the display geometry for the RBD packed object, I can visualize static object on its own. Here you can see that I increase the resolution of the volume collision, which is what we're using by default. So I think by default this is set to 30. Probably need to activate this so it recooks. There we go. So this is quite coarse, and to make sure that the pieces don't get stuck, I had to increase this resolution to make sure the shape is represented somewhat accurately. So this was fine for me. And here I also, on the physical tab, set the friction to 0 and the dynamic friction also to 0, so the pieces don't stick to the can. That's pretty much it for this setup. Drop down a gravity node, then I cache this out. I then offset the simulation to start at a frame that I felt was correct for my camera animation. So I wanted this to kind of start here, so I had enough space for the lightning bolt to strike so you could see that. So here it starts, so it's synced up with that. I just subtracted my offset value. In this case, I wanted to offset this animation by 16 frames about. And here, if you drop down a time shift node, you can just edit parameter interface. And then you grab a float value, drag this in here, call this offset, like so, apply that. Then you get an offset value, and I guess this shouldn't be a float, but sorry about that. It should be an integer, because we have integer frames. And then we call this offset, apply that, and then you can copy this value, copy parameter, click on the frame, so you get $frame, and then right click, right plus, and then right click, paste relative reference, and now you can just offset the frame range by whatever you want. Or in this case, minus, I want to subtract it, depending on what you want. Then I need to unpack this so I can delete the inside faces. So right now, if we go inside of here, we have all the interior faces of the fractured object. If we have a refractive material like we have here, like ice or glass, so if you're doing broken glass, for example, you would want to do the same, then we need to delete these interior faces to make sure that we don't get any render issues. Since if we render this, it will look pretty bad. The RBD disconnected faces node does all this, so you just drop this down and just change this to delete connected. If you have the RBD connected faces node up here, you will have all the information necessary for this to work automatically. So as you can see, if I go back to the unpack node, the interior faces are there. If I go down, the interior faces will be deleted, and they will pop back in right when the pieces get disconnected from the main bit. So it automatically deletes them based on if they're still together or not. So that's great, so we don't need to take care of that, and it renders perfectly a refractive material. And then here's a small velocity fix, because I realized when rendering, some velocities still get transferred through, so the initial velocities are visible. Control middle mouse click on the null here, and select my velocities, and then go back to a frame where there should not be any velocities, like I think, let's see, here. Here, nothing is moving, but we get crazy velocities, so this causes render issues with how I'm rendering it. So for me, the easiest way to get rid of this was just to drop down an attribute wrangle, scale the velocities to 0 here, so v at v multiplied, so mult equals 0. This scales them down to 0. And then I have another scale velocities attribute wrangle, and here I used a float to scale the velocities down by 0.15 because I run the whole simulation at time scale of 0.15. So if you want accurate velocities for the time that you have chosen, if you're actually playing the simulation at this 0.15 speed, you also have to scale the velocities down to match that. So this is what I did here. I just wrote a float attribute called timescale and then equals that to channel float. If you write channel float and then you name it where you want to name it, so this name will be used, and then just click on this icon up here and then it will make this. And then I just right clicked on scale time, copy the parameter here, and then I paste it here with the paste relative reference. So this is always going to be the same. So if you change this, this should update and you should be fine. And then I just switch over to scale velocities at one point. So at the beginning, I start off with a velocity of 0, and I think the annoying part is that I still have to add 2 frames here. So if current frame number is bigger than the number that's going to be printed on this side, which in this case I referenced the offset that I have here. So in this case I copied this and then I went down here and then I pasted this here. So right click, paste relative reference, and then you get this value, so 16. But I had to add another 2 frames basically to make sure that it works, because there's some frames at the start where the simulation doesn't move, but I still get those initial velocities. That's what I needed to do here. And then I think it switches over, should switch over at frame 18. Yeah, on frame 18, 19. So if it's bigger than 18, it switches. And that was perfect for me, because then I do get correct velocities. And this is what I render, the out ice. From the time shift node, I created an out node for my debris source. I just copy that. Then we jump over to the next bit, which is the debris from the ice. So I just added some small particles just for extra visual interest. If we dive in here, this is also pretty simple. So the node I just copied, you just object merge that here and then add a debris source node. I just selected the inside groups to make sure it only emits from the interior faces. That's what I wanted in this case. The rest frame I chose 28. In this case, it's the same as my start frame for my particle simulation here. So I just copied this, pasted it to my rest frame. You could also do it the other way around. Play with the density, so the amount of particles, and I animated the seed just so we have some variance between frames that where those particles are popping in. I then added a speed threshold here to make sure that only the faster moving, so if I template this, only the faster moving pieces actually emit particles, and you can decrease or increase depending on how much you want or need. Then I drop down a popnet, so if you drop down a popnet, you'll be greeted with everything you need for this. And the only thing I did here from the pop source, I just changed the emission type to all geometry. And then again, I have the same timescale as the ice that I have. So I just referenced that, went over there, copied that, and then pasted it here. Then cache this out. I again scale the velocities by the timescale, just like as before. Then I have an attribute wrangle to animate the alpha of the particles, so they fade out over time. If you want to see this attribute, the only thing you have to do is just make sure to have alpha written like this. So if you capitalize the A and make sure it's a float value, you just type in your value here. So you can also just type in a value, but since we're animating it, I just created a channel float and then animated this value down here. I added an attribute randomize for my p-scale and scale this down. And that's it for the ice and the debris. So next up we have the flip simulation. And this is also pretty straightforward actually. So we start off, bring in my can again. So I have a collision object. I template this to have a reference to where the simulation is going to move to. I just have a sphere here that I reshaped, subdivided it. I converted it to a VDB, in this case a fog VDB. So the volume noise fog can be used. This by default takes density, this fog noise. So I set this to set, increase the amplitude, and here I remap this with a ramp so I can control how many particles I'm going to have. So if I do a points from volume, then this is my starting point for my flip simulation. Here I create some initial velocities, so v at v equals channel vector, and call it val. You can just call it velocities, and you can rename this if you go into edit parameter and then click on this, and then here you can rename the label to whatever you want. Okay, and then here I have a visualize properties node. You could also just middle mouse here on velocities. Yeah, that takes a little bit of time and you can see them too, but here I just have a visualize properties node set up with point trail style visualizer with velocities attribute activated here so I can see what I'm doing. And as you can see, The velocities I chose here are pointing directly at the can, and they're firing a little bit up. So this is exactly what we're getting. We're getting the splash from behind the can. So here you could play, you could also add some noise like we did before, but in this case I just wanted it to be straight towards the can. And then the randomness of the actual source was enough for me for the breakup of the fluid. And in the DOPNet, yeah, the start frame is set to 30 because that's when the ice simulation starts, basically, when it breaks apart. So at this point, I kind of wanted the flip simulation to start moving. As you can see, we're not bringing in ice particles here because for the shot I was doing, that really did not add anything. And it just took way more time to run to simulate that. Adding those deforming collision geometry just took up a lot of time, and it didn't really add to the look I was going for this clip. So I decided against it and just stuck to the static collision in this case. So if we dive into the DOPNet, I have my flip object where in the initial data tab I bring in the emission points we created up here. So we just copy these and then paste that here. You can just look for it here, accept, and then make sure your input type is set to particle field. And here I set the particle separation, and for setting this up I use this as my base setting. So I just copy this, and up here I paste it into the point separation here. So I control the resolution from in here. Further down the line for the other nodes, for particle fluid surfaces here, this is also linked up. So I paste the relative reference from this value, so everything is synced up. For my guides, I set my particle guides to particles because by default they're set to sprites. I think it looks nicer to view them as particles, so I set it to that. In my flip solver, my time scale is set to 0.1. So it's also slower, which helps with these types of simulations. Otherwise you would need even more substeps than we have here. By default they're set to 1 and 2. And I had to increase these substeps to get a nice stable looking simulation for my fluids. And these settings worked well for me. Over at particle motion, I enabled use friction and bounce for the collision. I added an ID attribute and an age particles attribute. And these two are really important to retime the flip simulation later on. And here on the volume motion, we choose Apex Swirly because this works really well for the smaller scale fluids that should have surface tension. And the volume limits, go to your viewport and hit enter. You can scale down and up your volume limits. And in this case, I wanted to make sure that my simulation always stays in this volume limit, so I don't simulate anything that's unnecessary. So you'll have to have a camera animation and then see where you will need a simulation or not, because this really saves time. In the particle motion settings, we are also killing particles outside of the volume limits here. Once I have this set up, I usually just turn off this, and then if you go into your viewport and hit escape, those will be gone. If you leave that on, you'll always have this box, and if you reset your view with space F or H, then it'll always jump back to the whole volume limits, and I like to have that off so I can actually zoom in quicker. And then the only thing I changed on the flips over here was the surface tension, which I increased to 30. I added a gravity node, standard settings. I added a static object node, also standard settings. I didn't even change the resolution because in this case, this resolution worked out totally fine for the flip simulation. That's about it. I think the rest is all standard. We drop down in DOP import field node. Here you select your DOPNet, so this one here, and then you select your flip object inside of the DOPNet. So you just select that one, or you can just go inside here, the flip object, copy that, and then you can just paste it here. If you click on here and you want a relative path, you can just click here, export relative path. While having this selected, click accept, and it will convert this to a relative path. So if you copy this somewhere else, it will still work inside of here. Here for the presets, just choose flip fluids, and that's it. Then drop down the fluid compress node, and this makes sure that you only keep the attributes that are necessary for flip meshing. Here you can keep everything on default. The only thing that you have to make sure of is that your particle separation is the same as you have in your DOPNet as with your points from volume. should be the same value everywhere. Best is to sync it up. And then you just cache it out. And in this case, I wanted to cache out double the amount of frames that I have in the scene, so 240 frames, because I wanted to speed it up at the end. Then I use a particle fluid surface node to actually view this compressed fluid, because if you just view the fluid compressed, then you'll just see something like this in your viewport. Just drop down a particle fluid surface node, choose particles, and that's it. Here I retime this, so I don't have this cache right now, so I can't really preview it, but the only thing I did here was I increased the input range to encapsulate everything I cached out here. So in this case 1 to 240, output frame range is 1 to 140. Then I just animate the speed here manually. So as you can see here, we just have a nice curve going from 1 to 2.5 at frame 70 to frame 86. And then make sure to enable scale velocities. Otherwise your velocities in the end won't look correct, because the speed will change, but the velocities will stay the same. I drop down another particle fluid surface node. Here we want to surface those polygons. Everything else is set to default. Again, make sure to have particle separation linked up. And then we mesh this whole thing. And then I do the scaling of the velocities again. The amount I have set here on the flip solver. So on the substeps here, I copy this to make sure this always stays the same. And then I just link it up here, so my velocities always look right. And that's it for the flip. Now we go over to lightning setup. I start off very simple by using a line, drop that down, then I resample that to get a few more points. I also activate curve view attribute, increase the resolution here, set the curve view attribute. Then I drop down a group node so I can group this main bolt. So I have basically two parts. I have the main bolt, and then I have the secondary bolts coming off the main lightning bolt. I then use a delete node to set that to points and random, and then I increase the percentage to delete the number of points where I don't want the secondary bolts to be scattered. Then I drop down an attribute wrangle. So I feed the curve view attribute into the p-scale. Just type in f at p-scale equals chramp, and then name your ramp, type in the attribute to be remapped. In this case, you want curve view. And then I have a multiplier, so I can control the total length of the secondary lightning bolts. So as you can see here, now I can just control the overall length and the curve distribution of the secondary bolts. And then I added an attributes randomize for the normals, because the normals by standard are used by the copy to points node for rotation. These are the settings that worked well for me, so I use direction or orientation, set the dimensions to 3 and the cone angle to something like this. And you can also just preview this and just play around with the settings here. After I copy this line onto these points, I just resample it, also give it a curve view attribute. I add a secondary bolt group, so I have control over these separately from the main one. Then I merge these together, and then I add some noise with the attribute VOP. If we dive into that attribute VOP, we can see the setup, taking the position and then adding some turbulent noise to it. So we take a turbulent noise, we plug in the position into the position here, and then again you just middle mouse click on the things you want to promote further up. And in this case, it's everything, so you could also just right click after connecting everything up and then click Vex. It's not here because everything's already created, but if you would have room, if there wouldn't have been created, then this option should be here, create input parameters. That would be there then. And then I added a time to the offset. So plugging that in gives you a time value which changes. And then I just multiplied that with a value that I called speed here. And then I can control the speed up here. So now I have control of how fast that is moving. And I have control over the frequency and the amplitude here from the noise. And then I add an attribute wrangle, and I do basically the same thing we did here for the p-scale, but in this case we use it to drive the width attribute, and I make sure to just select the secondary first, the main one, so I can control width of the polywire here with these nodes separately. So I have total control over that, so I can have like smaller secondary lightning bolts, and I can change where the thickness lies with both of these, which is pretty nice. So I have that. And then in my polywire, the wire radius set to this value, 0.0025. And then instead of constant, I change this to attribute to use the width attribute we created here. So we get this nice fall off towards the end. Transformed this to fit the spot where I wanted it to be. So for this, you would want to look at your can and your ice. You can see how that looks. So I moved it to where it looked right. And then the strike animation, I use 2 carve nodes. So the carve node just lets you delete parts of a curve and drop down a carve node. You can see that if I change this, it will delete either from the beginning to the end or from the end to the beginning. And then I just used this, separated the main group and the secondary group, so I have control over when those come in. And then just did some manual animation, and then I got this. I separated this out and created another out node for a redshift light. And the polywire here is set to be way thicker. So I have the same transformation here, so I should probably just link this up. So if you want to create a reference copy of a node, you can also just right-click, Actions, Create Reference Copy, and then you'll have a reference copy of that, so you don't have to copy this over manually. You can just change this now and it will update as well here. So I just made a way thicker lightning bolt, and I did this so the light has more area and the light has more impact on the scene. Rendering this, and then I'm using the out redshift light here to drive a lightning light. And you do this by just setting up a redshift light set to area, and then here on shape, instead of rectangle, you go to mesh and then just link this up. In this case, I didn't want it to be visible because I wanted the small shape of the lightning to be visible, but I wanted some extra light area to simulate the impact of how bright lightning is without me having to crank up the lighting intensity of the incandescent material, so the emission material of this light, because that just gives you more noise and just makes it look a little bit more unclean, but doing it like this is a little bit more controlled. Finally, I added a floor at the bottom to give some bounce light, to brighten up the bottom a little bit. The primary ray visibility is set off, so it's not visible in the camera, but it will still bounce light around. And for the ice debris, always make sure if you're rendering particles to have render objects as particles selected. And then I have a background, which is also just plain in the back here. I guess now we should go over the lighting. So I'm just going to turn off all the lights and turn them on one by one so you can see what they do. So this is where we start off, basically. I have the lightning light, this thick lightning bolt, so if I turn that on, I think I need to reload this so it loads in. It will give us more light volume, as you can see here, so it looks like there's way more impact from the lightning strike. I then have a background light, which is just, here we go. So the lightning bolt light is here, as you can see. Oops. And then I added a background light to light up the background, so we get a nice gradient. So if we turn this on, see, we get this nice gradient. Then I have a dome light, just some random HDRI, studio HDRI from Polyhaven, just to brighten up the whole image a little bit, give a little bit of general lighting. And then I have, here I have a background light for the ice, so I get this nice edge lighting here. And I think on this frame it's pretty extreme, the lightning bolt light on this one frame, so I'm just gonna go back one frame here, reload that. So here we have the, as you can see, the light, the rim light. There's the ice rim light, it's just an area light. And I turned down the spread a little bit to make it less soft so it doesn't wrap around that much the object. And if I go a little bit, go to the end for the, I'll just deactivate this. Just go over the light for the can. So I have separate lights for the cans here, as you can see. And all of these are linked to just light the can. So enable light mesh association and just link those up. If I go through these one by one, so this is how the can would look without any of the can lights. A little bit boring, but I like the look of the lighting on the ice, but I didn't want to interfere with that after I had set that up. So the easiest way is just to do separate lights for the can. And here I added a frontal light to the can, and I used a texture for this, which you can link up here. So if you go to texture, you can just write up, you can just write this and just paste the string or the location of procedurally created texture. So in a cop node, I just added a shape, scaled it down a bit by half, blurred it a bunch, and then I have an out node. And if you just copy this, you jump back, you can just, so you just write up this and then paste that in, and then you'll get the texture. And this just makes it that I get a nicer fall off on those highlights here. So I have that. And then I have a light from the bottom left, just an area light. So I get this nice highlight over there, as you can see there. And then I have the same thing on the right. And then I have a top light from the right here, which creates this highlight. Then I have another one that creates this highlight. And to control all these lights and have a little bit of animation on those, I just created a null. So you just create a null, you go to Edit Parameter Interface, select everything and click Invisible. And now you can drag in new parameters. In this case, I wanted a bunch of float values. Click Accept and Apply. And these float values, which you can rename here. So light control 1, for example, and so on. I should probably stop rendering. And now you can just copy this parameter, go to your light that you had set up, and multiply it with that relative reference from this one. So you have this control then to control a number of lights. For example, here I have can light control, which controls all of these lights at once, which is pretty nice. So I just have one value to animate. So I have them turning on after the ice breaks. And the lightning light also gets turned on and off here. So the impact of that light is also controlled a little bit. And I have an animation for the HDRI light as well, I think, yeah. So this is a pretty nice way of doing things. And that's pretty much it for the lighting. And then for the render settings, just have enough samples to render it out at a setting that is acceptable for you. In this case, I just set it to automatic 0.01. Took a little while, but looks good. And then just enabled motion blur. I think the transfer instance steps don't really need to be this high for this scene, but I did set them up a little bit. And this is new. Before, this wasn't really an option, but I like the movie setting because the 180 shutter degree rule is pretty standard and that works out pretty well. So for the materials, for the can label, so if you hold down R and click and drag over a node, you will be able to preview it in your viewport. So for this, I just created a texture with ChatGPT, just aligned it like so here. And then I just crushed the image with a black and white ramp and fed that into the metalness, played around with that a bit to get some variance, and did the same but with different values for the roughness of the reflection. The metal material here at the top is just a standard metal material. For the fluid, it's just again standard water material from the RS materials, and then I just changed the color and I used the parameter to animate the opacity so it blends out at the end. If you drop down a parameter, name it here, plug it in, and then you'll be able to animate it from up here. For the ice, it's just a refractive material. I played around with the IRR a little bit to get a look that I liked. I used a texture from ambient. So for the ice material, I used a texture from ambientcg.com. They provide CC0 textures, which is great. It is just a standard rock material, and the only thing I used here is a normal material to give it a little bit more structure. And then again, as before, I animated the opacity to fade out the pieces at the end. For the ice debris, I don't think it really matters that much, but in this case, I think I just used the same material as the ice, just removing the texture. And again, I'm using an alpha that I animated on the particles itself. So just drop down a particle attribute lookup node, PS point attribute node, and then type in alpha like this. The lightning is just a standard incandescent node with the intensity set to 50. And the floor and the background are just standard materials diffused with a little bit of reflection. Gray, both gray. Oh no, the background I actually made it blue. The floor is gray, the background is blue. And that's about it.